Hi, folks. Hope you're all doing reasonably well in this time of horrors. I last talked about China the end of May, and I was wearing a red shirt. If you want to go back to that, I'm going to try not to repeat myself. But so much has been going on that I think I want to catch us up a little bit and talk about more recent events. But let me frame the discussion by saying before Trump ever came into power, China was rising, right? And the Obama administration was sensitive to this issue and tried to rally allies in Europe and the rest of the world to organize whenever necessary to stop China in its track or at least exert some pressure, and was particularly keen on setting up the Trans Pacific Partnership, hoping that by organizing Southeast Asian countries and the United States and some Latin Americans in alliance, some pressure could be applied on China to undercut its worst tendencies as it was getting increasingly interested in expanding its activities beyond the China itself. So then Trump comes into power, and we have America first. China is taking advantages of. We need to have a trade reform, which then was announced as a trade war. To stop products from coming in the US, to repatriate manufacturing back into the US, and so on. And this was increasingly isolating the US in world affairs and looked slightly wacko. But then, of course, the virus comes along. And as the virus comes along, we know, just not to repeat everything, that we immediately blamed the virus on China. And we escalated threats against China with respect to trade. And then, of course, that was escalated by China's own actions and its feeling its oats, so to speak, and doing various expansionary things, which I want to talk about in a minute, which further allowed the United States and even some of its allies to say, whoa, what is China doing? We need to offer some resistance. In the process of all of these sort of swirling around for the first 2 years in the Trump administration, and a lot of China bashing started. You have to blame someone, you can't blame us. It increasingly became apparent that China was not paying a whole lot of attention because there was no real consolidated pressure. So even though the humanitarian disaster in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and these camps and the huge violation of human rights got some attention, especially by lobby groups and human rights groups, we didn't really do a whole lot with it because Trump was eager to befriend President Xi. He didn't really say very much about anything. And also, it became increasingly apparent that Trump did extremely well with other dictators, came in North Korea, uh, the East European authoritarians, Turkey, and so forth. So there was every reason for China to believe that its authoritarian tendencies might get some criticism on part of the US, but was not going to derail its otherwise productive relations with the United States. So along comes the virus and the blame of the virus on China, which sounded reasonable because China, of course, as we know, messed up in December, and I don't need to rehearse all of that. But what became increasingly apparent, and is totally apparent now, is that whatever role China played in not catching and warning the world of the pandemic last December, that was a possibility. What's increasingly obvious now is that China and quite a lot of other countries have managed to clamp down on the virus in minimum minimize the virus, and when hotspots arise, to pat them down. And that the one country which is where the COVID is completely out of control, really, or at least I may be exaggerating slightly, is the United States, which has the highest numerical outbreak and the highest death rate in the world. So now we are in a situation where Trump continues to blame China, and this is quite popular. And at the same time, the world, meaning our allies, non-allies who look to the US for leadership, are now in a position to say, well, whatever role China's played in all of this, it's really the United States that is not capable of coping. And that has made apparent to the global population, not just well-read elites in various countries, the dysfunctionality in the United States, its inability to have a national public health service that can manage this crisis, its technological shortages in the medical field, its inability to test properly, to trace properly, its shortages in hospitals. It then comes Black Lives Matter, which show about to everybody in the world the inequality in the US. So the US, which used to be perceived as perhaps not a perfect and in some ways defective country, in some ways has now had the image of a country which essentially can cope, which is not a role model for anyone in the positive sense, but a role model of how a capitalist society, which increases its inequities between rich and poor, which does not mind its development of its infrastructure, which is does not have national health care, which has no social programs of any kind on a national scale that really bail people out. So everybody's looking at us, and especially the Chinese, I want to get back to the Chinese, are looking at us and saying, whoa, these people who we in very many ways admired, especially Chinese who opposed the regime, very much admired American democracy, American free speech, America's economic freedoms, are looking at the US and saying, actually, our countries, China, is much more functional. We may have a dictatorship, it may be a communist dictatorship, but actually, we have an infrastructure that works. We had a medical system that is able to address the virus. We have lots of research going on in some technological fields. For example, artificial intelligence, we're actually ahead of the United States. So from a Chinese population perspective, never mind the government, the US now looks nothing like a role model or anything you want to admire, and very much looks like a country that can manage itself under a president who is some kind of cuckoo bird. And so the various warnings of the US, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, but by and large sound fairly hollow to Chinese. So why is this important in world affairs? It's important because the Chinese now think, well, we have pretty much fair reign. So the move on to Hong Kong, which is very unfortunate, worth taking a risk doing this now because the US is largely out of lunch and has very little leverage internationally. Movement of various kinds in economic areas that are illegal by World Trade Organization standards. Well, we can just go ahead because the World Trade Organization has been undermined and is not now in a position to do anything. Then the South China Sea. The South China Sea, by the way, is larger than a Mediterranean. And as you know from the past, they have built these artificial islands in the sea, and they're now claiming it part of the territory of of China. So the United States comes along and other countries and saying, no, China can't just take things over and do the things it does in the South China Sea. That's against the law of the sea. Well, the law of the sea does allow for a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. And the Chinese say, well, it's part of our exclusive economic zone. The fact that they're falsifying this because of the islands and other things falls between the cracks of most people in the world, and for that matter, even the Chinese, right? So then the US comes along and says, well, what you're doing is illegal. And the Chinese say to themselves, well, the US didn't even sign and ratify, well, they signed it, but it didn't ratify the Law of the Sea Treaty. They're not even part of it. What are they talking about? They're complaining us violating something that they're not even party to. Now, it's true, of course, that even though the US never ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty, we have by and large been adhering to it. But so there's trouble in Hong Kong. There's trouble in the South China Sea. There are troubles in various other, even obscure parts. I don't want to bore you with all the details. But for example, the Chinese are now fishing in the oceans near the Galapagos Islands. Well, the Galapagos Islands aren't anywhere near China. They're in South America, near Ecuador, right? Some of you might have visited the Galapagos. Well, that's against various fishing rules, right? And the Chinese need fish. Lots of countries are fishing illegally in various parts of the world, the North Sea, and has treaties. But the Chinese could allow themselves, at least for a time, not to really get the wrath of the world in international institutions, because the international institutions have been weakened by the US. The US, no one is paying particular attention to the US at this point. And while on the one hand, we send another bunch of men up into space and it's all quite miraculous and they land safely in the ocean, it's not even clear to the Chinese government, much less the Chinese people, that we are so advanced in every aspect technologically. And then underneath all of this is a situation where the Chinese must be chuckling to themselves because in some of the economic assistance that Congress has voted for example, for small businesses, where the U.S. taxpayers have dished out, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars, some of this has actually gone to the Chinese because the Chinese own a lot of businesses. They are branches of Chinese businesses, but they operate as American businesses. So the irony of how we're being both not consistent and not particularly smart about where China and the US interact and how interwoven we are. You have a situation where we, the taxpayers, are paying out money to some Chinese companies, not in China, but in the United States. The economic pages of the Wall Street Journal and New York Times have been covering this recently, but it's been going on now for a month or so. So that all leads the Chinese to say, okay, we can be fairly authoritarian, we can spread our wings, we can do things we might have been hesitant to do because we do like being liked. We have lots of relations in 170 countries. We don't want to queer those relations. But now that nobody is watching and nobody can hold us to account, we might as well try things that we would not have been gotten away with. So not only is China rising, but China is expanding its economic and political role in the world, while it is getting accused by the United States. And the assumption must be by the part of the administration that pointing out all of China's wrongdoing will weaken it. But actually, by and large, so far, I may take it all back in a month or two, China essentially gets away with it. And while it's true that militarily we're still ahead of China, although China is making very rapid military progress, people really don't believe, unless we become totally crazy, that we're going to start a military conflict with China anytime soon. So that gets us back to the idea of a kind of a Cold War, right? It's a war of words, but it's more than a war of words. It is queering our relationship with our biggest competitor, and down within this decade, probably the most powerful country in the world, at a time in which diplomacy, having good relations in all those areas where there are joint interests, and there are many joint interests between the United States and China, even if the Trump administration doesn't recognize them. Um, we're querying those relationships for the future, and will make it very difficult, even if Biden wins, to put this all back on track. It will take a long time. But looking at it from an American perspective, we are also doing damage to ourselves. We're doing damage to our economy, which God knows is doing very badly. 30% reduction in the last month or so in our economy. Is China suffering as well economically because of the virus? Yes, but they are in fact taking action so the population doesn't suffer. China is doing what it always does, and it does very well, which is plowing tons of money into infrastructure, which keeps the economy going, which keeps people employed, and so forth. So in some senses, the Chinese are not suffering as much as the Americans are, either because of the virus itself or the economic downturn. So far at least. And then we're doing more self-harm to ourselves by doing even other strange sorts of things. For example, the new immigration regulations of not allowing Chinese students in who've had any relationship with the government, the security services, the military, and also making it difficult for Chinese students to stay who are already here, not reissuing visas for graduate students who are already here, and making it difficult for companies, which American companies, even the big companies, which very much rely on Chinese personnel, technical people, scientists, and all the rest. There has One of the strongest ways for a country to build itself, its scientific infrastructure, its educational infrastructure, is to be as open as possible to attract the best talents from around the world. And the best way to help itself is to not chuck that talent out of the country. So one can look at it narrowly and say, well, this is just a kind of an economic issue. Maybe it's worthwhile for, let's say, Google and Microsoft to lose the personnel that it wants. After all, there are many unemployed Americans, but most of the unemployed Americans are not the people with PhDs and technical skills for the computer industry. So that's not going to resolve anything, right? But it's also has a political side to it. And that is that people who are educated in the United States around the world make it a lot easier for the US to have relationship with countries. Most of the elite in Southeast Asia, much of the elite, at least in the scientific fields in China, much of the elite all over the world have gone to college or universities and gotten graduate degrees in the United States. You can make a very long list of the heads of states of various countries, from Greece to China to Vietnam to, every imaginable country, where people have links into the United States because they received an education in the United States. And when you cut those umbilical cords, you not only weaken potential access to skilled people, but you weaken the future of your diplomatic and social relations with other countries. Another country which did this on a smaller scale and suffered similarly was England. The United Kingdom under Margaret Thatcher also banned foreign students and radically reduced the foreign students, even from the empire, but also from other countries in the English universities. That was very harmful to the United Kingdom. And I urge you to think about how harmful it will be, not just economically and technologically and scientifically, but in terms of future social and political relations of the United States with the rest of the world, and also most particularly with China. So I think the events of the last few weeks, of the last 2 months since we last discussed China, have ratcheted up the destructiveness of America's relationship with China. And what we tend to keep looking at is all the things that China is doing that are bad in terms of international affairs, that are wrong in terms of human rights. And one can make an inventory of China, this authoritarian government, doing all kinds of things which a democratic society shouldn't approve of. But on the other hand, the politics of it right now are so bad, and the leverage and the influence that the U.S. enjoys are so tiny and have been so destroyed in the last few years that we hardly are in the position to exercise some political leverage to say, whoa, China, really, you shouldn't do that. And furthermore, because we're so weakened, even in the years to come, if we want to exercise any leverage on China or other authoritarian regimes, we're going to need our allies again. We're going to need Europe, other industrial countries, other democratic countries, because by now we have a reputation of speaking with forked tongues, right? We criticize others, but we domestically are in total disarray as others see us. And America alone is also absolutely not a recipe for a declining country to continue to have some political, economic, and moral leverage, even if we pride ourselves for some years to come on having military leverage, or spending a lot of money on the military. Even that isn't clear. And while we have had in the past a superb national security apparatus, even that looks rather frayed, right? And even there we look hypocritical, right? The Russians, which are the ones that are undermining our elections and spying right and left, aren't not being criticized, but the Chinese are criticized. How do we criticize them? We close a consulate in Texas by saying there's spies in that consulate, and then the Chinese reciprocate by closing an American consulate in China, in Chengdu. Now, let me just say on that particular subject, American consulates and embassies all over the world are spying. It is not just the Chinese. So this is pretty crazy. And the amount of spying that the Chinese have done in Texas probably doesn't equate with the amount of spying, let's say, that Russia is doing right now in various parts of the United States. I'm not promoting spying. All I'm saying is that sophisticated people in other governments look at the gesture of closing a consulate as really a silly gesture, which somehow makes the Trump administration look like they're doing something. But in point of fact, this is playing games, but the games have costs attached to them, because the games, in fact, are reducing our reputation, are making life worse in trying to deal with the areas of China that we really can deal with. And finally, on the China topic, China knows, and so does the rest of the world, that we're even hypocritical on the economic side of things, right? We say tariffs, this, that, and the other thing, but then Trump wants to get reelected, and we allow all the corn and the soybeans and the pigs and whatever to continue to be shipped to China. China knows this. China knows this is a game. China knows that Trump can't afford to do in the farmers in the Middle West. And so life goes on more or less as normal, even though the Trump rhetoric is we're doing all these terrible things to China to try to get them to change their policies. Well, take it all with a grain of salt. I am not whitewashing what the Chinese are doing. What I'm saying is that the Chinese feel very much empowered by the disastrous failure on the part of the United States in dealing with the virus, in dealing with our economic woes, in terms of Black Lives Matter and the inequality. Uh, and even things like we criticize the Chinese, for example, for imprisoning political opposition, which indeed they do, and indeed they should be criticized. On the other hand, the Chinese look at the U.S. and they say, right, 13% of Americans are African American, are Black, and 40% of the prison population are Black. What is that all about, right? So, and what is it all about when friends of the president get pardoned and don't have to do prison term? In other words, they can show how we are hypocritical, how we are in disarray, how we are violating really all kinds of human rights, how Americans right now are food deprived in large numbers, where, the serious economic impact on the poorest American of the virus is far different than it's for China, because in China, the Chinese are supplying their poorest people at least with enough food, except for, the absolutely few million very poor people. But for the substantial numbers of the Chinese is looking after the people in at least what seems to be a better way than the US. So they sit around and they say, listen, guys, don't preach to us. And this is a very bad place for the US to be in. And it's a place politically where both populists on the right and populists on the left will use the China bashing and the Cold War with China to their interests. But we should inform ourselves and be very careful because what we see China doing is not desirable. But what we see ourselves doing to ourselves is really not just not desirable, but is consistently weakening us in having any leverage to have any influence on anybody in the world, because we have all of a sudden ceased being a role model. So on that depressing note, I will end. And one of the things I want to talk about the next time has to do with migrations in the world and how the virus on a global scale is impacting the movement of people and other smaller economies. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, watching, and be well until we meet again. Bye.